back for those of you who are back. If you're seated up there and would like to come down here, we don't have cooties. It's okay. You can come down here, or you can stay up there and we'll wave. Okay.
There's students.
Or Ted says, as a good teacher, you have to come down here right this minute.
Come on, actors, come down here.
Come down here, please.
That's how I treat my faculty.
Thank you, and as you're coming down to the front here, thank you. Welcome back. We have a similar but very different at the same time panel this afternoon. We have the perspective of two artists, and we have one of the preeminent scholars in the world on Syrian theater and Saud Wannous. So let me begin by introducing them. First, I'd like to begin with Muhammad al-Attar, who's a playwright and dramaturg. He studied at Damascus University, the Higher Institute of Dramatic Arts in Damascus, and Goldsmiths in London. His works have been performed in Damascus, London, New York, Seoul, Berlin, and elsewhere. They include Withdrawal, Smash, Online, A Chance Encounter, Intimacy, and Antigone of Syria, which some of you may have seen here at Masr al-Madina, which was quite extraordinary. Al-Attar has written for numerous magazines and newspapers with a special focus on the Syrian uprising. Our second speaker is Edward Zitter, and Edward is, or Ted as he's affectionately known, is an associate professor of theater history and chair of the Department of Drama at Tisch School of the Arts, NYU. He is author of Political Performance in Syria, From the Six-Day War to the Syrian Uprising, which just came out, and I can't recommend it highly enough, and The Orient on the Victorian Stage. He has published articles in Theater Survey, Theater Journal, TDR, Theater Research International, The Wordsworth Circle, and several anthologies. And then our third speaker will be my friend and collaborator, the wonderful Sahar Asaf. Sahar is an assistant professor in the Department of Fine Arts and Art History at the American University of Beirut. She directed Rituals of Signs and Transformations and The Rape, both by Saud Wannous. In addition to Watch Your Step, Beirut Heritage Walking Tour, a performance about memories of the Lebanese Civil War. In 2014, she was selected to participate in the renowned Directors Lab at Lincoln Center in New York City. So those are our three panelists for this afternoon. Muhammad is going to speak in Arabic, and then there'll be a brief summary for those who don't speak Arabic or don't speak it well, that Rula, who translated Dima Wannous' statement this morning, will offer. But for those of you who don't, I think, at least in his case, it's worthwhile to read his abstract, which is in the program. Muhammad's going to speak on Wannous' influence on his generation of playwrights and theater makers. His talk proposes a rereading of Wannous' late plays against the background of the uprisings in the Arab world, and in particular the Syrian uprising. Wannous' late plays, such as Rituals of Signs and Transformations, Historical Miniatures, and Drunken Days, show a shift from the writer-intellectual who wants to change the world with theater to the writer-intellectual who wants to understand the world through theater, and from a theater that has ready answers to a theater that puts forth questions. In these texts, the search for truth in a multiplicity of truths and narratives comes to the fore. This search is closely linked to freedom and liberation. Muhammad, please proceed.
Thank you very much. Just I'll start my few words in English. Who don't speak Arabic here? Only you. 1, 2, 3, 4. Sorry. Okay. Sorry, but it's much better for me to speak in Arabic, really, so I beg your pardon. بالحقيقة لما انطلب مني شارك بالندوة، كان العنوان المقترح للمداخلة أو للكلمة من سونيا هو يعني محاولة استكشاف تأثير ونوس على الكتاب الشباب، كتاب يعني جيلي تقريبا من كتاب المسرحيين السوريين. أوكي. أنا اقترحت إنه عندي رغبة كان أحكي كيف يمكن اليوم بالنسبة لنا ككتاب شباب عم نستحضر أعمال ونوس تحديدا المرحلة الأخيرة على ضوء الثورات العالم العربي وتحديدا الثورة السورية، بس احتراما لطلب المنظمين بس يعني حأعمل قسمين. القسم الأول هو نحكي فيه عن تأثير ونوس أو ما أراه يعني لتأثير ونوس على جيلي من كتاب الشباب، والقسم الثاني باختصار سأتحدث فيه عن ملامح أعتقدها راهنة جدا في نصوص ونوس الأخيرة على ضوء أحداث سوريا الحالية أو الثورات العربية والثورة السورية بشكل خاص. إذن في تأثير ونوس على جيل من كتاب مسرحيين الشباب، أكاد أجزم أن لسعد الله ونوس حضور لا يمكن نكرانه في الدرب التي تلمس فيه أبناء جيلي معرفة المسرحية كقراء أولا، ومن ثم محاولتنا الأولى للكتابة للخشبة. كان إرث ونوس حاضرا بقوة في المعهد العالي للفنون المسرحية الذي ساهم هو بالذات في تأسيسه. المعهد كما هو معروف هو الرافد الأول للحركة المسرحية في سوريا. القلة وهم قلة بالفعل مما وقعوا في إغواء الكتابة المسرحية من جيل الشباب في سوريا وفضلوه على الكتابة للتلفزيون اللي هو منجم الذهب يعني، أو كتابة أجناس أدبية أخرى تلقى رواجا أكبر كالرواية والقصة والشعر، كانوا في معظمهم من خريجي المعهد العالي للفنون المسرحية. كطلاب في المعهد علاقتنا بونوس لم تتشكل فقط عبر قراءة ودراسة نصوصه بوصفه الكاتب المسرحي السوري المعاصر الأكثر شهرة، وإنما تعدتها إلى نقاشات معمقة دارت حوله ومعه وبقيت تحيط بنا بعد سنوات من رحيله المبكر في عام 1997. أساتذتنا في المعهد إما كانوا زملاء له من حقبة المؤسسين، كنت بتمنى يكونوا هون هلا، أمثال دكتور ماريلياس، دكتور حان قصاب حسن، نبيل حفار وغيرهم، وإما طلابا لديك في المعهد وثم أصبحوا زملاء له ومن ثم أساتذة لنا مثل مصطفى عبود ومياد حسين. هؤلاء نقلوا لنا ذكريات حية أسعفتنا أكثر على فهم ونوس وفهم مراحل اشتغاله المسرحي. هناك بالطبع أيضا حوارات ومقالات نظرية له منشورة في كتب ودوريات متعددة، أبرزها مجلة الحياة المسرحية التي كانت تصدر عن وزارة الثقافة في سوريا المعهد العالي للفنون المسرحية، والتي أوكل له بالذات أيضا إطلاقها في العام 1977. بياناته من أجل مسرح عربي جديد كانت إحدى القراءات الواجبة لنا. صور عرض منمنات تاريخية التي أنجزته بنائل الأطرش كمشروع تخرج في المعهد العالي للفنون المسرحية كانت تشغل جزء من أروقة المعهد في الطابق الأرضي وصولا للطابق الثاني، حيث سمي أحد المسرحيين الصغيرين الجميلين في المعهد باسم سعد الله بالذات، فيما أطلق اسم صديقه وشريكه المسرحي فواز ساجر على المسرح الثاني. فونوس إذن في غيابه كما في حضوره كان يشغل حيزا أساسيا في فضائنا المسرحي في المعهد العالي. لكن كيف ترجم هذا الحضور كتأثير علينا كطلاب ومن ثم كممارسين مسرحيين؟ هنا يجب علي أن أصارحكم أنه عندما طلب مني المشاركة تحت العنوان الذي اقترحته سونيا وهو تأثير سعد الله، أعتقد أني يعني أول ما تبادر ذهني أن سعد الله صورته كمثقف يعني منشغل بقضايا الشأن العام هي أقوى ربما من صورته ككاتب مسرحي. طيب أنا سأكون حذر يعني، إذ لا يجب أن يفهم التمييز أن فصل الشيئين ممكن عند سعد الله ونوس، إلا أن حديثي هنا يتوخى التمييز بين تأثيره كمثقف ملتزم بقضايا إنسانية جوهرية في زمن انحطاط وبين تأثيرات تقنية من وحي تجربته ككاتب مسرحي. في البدء يبلغ ذلك الحضور للمثقف القدوة الذي برهن أن الكتابة للمسرح ممكنة في أزمنة ثقافية رديئة جدا، لا بل أنها تمثل حاملا لمشروع ثقافي ومعرفي. صورة ونوس بالنسبة لنا لجيلي كانت صورة لمثقف منشغل بقضايا التغيير والعدالة والحرية. المسرح كان وسيطا إذن، كان حقلا حيويا للتعبير عن هذه القضايا والتفكير بها. بتأمل بسيط اليوم أعتقد أننا كنا فعلا بحاجة لهذه القدوة، وربما صنعناها أيضا بالمناسبة. كنا نبحث عن رمز أو شخصية اعتبارية نستمد منها قوة المحاججة حول أهمية وجود المسرح في حياتنا. بهذا المعنى قصدت أن صورة ونوس المثقف أحيانا تغلب على صورته ككاتب مسرحي. فأبناء جيلي واجهوا تهميشا متعاظما للمسرح ومكانته وقيمته، فترة انحطاط بلغت ذرا جديدة لم يعاصرها ونوس نفسه من حسن حظه يعني، في ظل صعود سريع للتلفزيون حليف كل الأنظمة السياسية والاقتصادية وحتى الاجتماعية المحافظة، وتراجع مضطرد في دعم المسرح ومكانته تزامن مع سيطرة شبكات من المثقفين صنيعة السلطة السياسية في سوريا أو مقربين منها على مفاصل الإنتاج الثقافي والمسرحي في سوريا، وضيق متزايد في هوامش العمل المستقل خارج هذه الشبكات. إن تطور ونوس ككاتب مسرحي الذي رافق تطوره المعرفي كمثقف معني على الدوام بقضايا أشمل كالعدالة الاجتماعية والتحرر ومناهضة الظلم أتاح لجيلي فرصة عظيمة لفهم تأثيرات الوعي السياسي على عملية الكتابة المسرحية وأسئلة الشكل والمضمون. فمع ونوس وبفضله عرفنا أكثر عن علاقة السياسة بالمسرح، وهذا يعني أنا شخصيا بالنسبة لي هذا هو فضل كبير. يعني كان لمصطلحي الأثير مسرح التسييس وقعا كبيرا في إدراكنا لهذه العلاقة أي بين المسرح والسياسي، حتى وأن لم نلتزم يعني ممارسين بقواعد هذا المسرح الذي تجاوزه ونوس نفسه في مراحل لاحقة من تجربته. يجب أن نتذكر أن جيلي ترعرع وهو يشاهد مسرح دريد لحام مثلا، تعرفوه صح؟ أوكي. ودراما تلفزيونية شبيهة كانت تنتقد سلطات جائرة وظالمة، لكنها في الوقت نفسه تحظى بعلاقات ممتازة مع هذه الأنظمة والسلطات. كتابات ونوس النظرية باعتقادي كانت سندا مهما لنا في تفكيك ظواهر مخادعة لمسرح سياسي دعائي، وفي بناء تصورات أعمق عن فعالية المسرح السياسي والاجتماعي في مجتمعات تخضع لحكم أنظمة شمولية كالنظام السوري. هلا بالانتقال للمستوى الثاني أي تأثير ونوس علينا ككاتب مسرحي يعني وليس كمثقف فقط، يعني أعتقد أن هذا التأثير ترجم في أوضح أشكاله عبر الاستفادة من رحلة بحث ونوس الطويلة عن شكل مسرحي يتناسب ودور المسرح وفهمه دور المسرح التنويري كما آمن به ونوس. مثلا جيلي فهم بريخت وتقنيات المسرح الملحمي أفضل عبر تجارب ونوس المتأثرة بفهمه لبريخت ووضعه لهذا الفيلم في سياق أقرب لنا ولثقافتنا. ينطوي الأمر ذاته على سبيل المثال على المسرح الوثائقي وتجربة بيتر فايس. أتحدث هنا عن نقاط قوة ونقاط ضعف في هذه التجارب. سأستطرد قليلا إذا سمحتم لي لأوضح. تأثر ونوس كبير ببريخت والمسرح الملحمي كحامل لعلاقة المسرح مع الجمهور وبالتالي مع قضية التحريض على التغيير الواقع، وكيف ترجم ونوس هذا التأثر بدأب عال على التجريب والبحث عن معادلات محلية جعلته ينتقل من اقتباس مباشر في البداية لتقنيات بريخت مرحلة التسييس إلى فهم أعمق ومختلف لاحقا لعلاقة المسرح بقضايا التغيير. هذه الرحلة اللي عند ونوس الحقيقة كانت بالنسبة لنا معينة لأن نفهم بريخت بطريقة أفضل، وربما هذا ما جعل أبناء جيل يتجنبون يعني اقتباس بريخت الحرفي الذي وقع به ونوس بالبداية. بمعنى يعني إذا بدي أحكي هيك بأبسط يعني رحلة ونوس خلتنا الحقيقة يعني نستفيد من بحثه الدؤوب يعني لفهم أعمق لعلاقة المسرح بالتغيير، وبالتالي نحن كجيل انتصرنا أكثر لمبدأ الحكاية على مبدأ الأمثولة اللي كانت قوية بنصوص ونوس الأولى. يعني بمعنى أنا لا أذكر أنه في حدا من كتاب جيلي جرب يعمل مسرحيات تعتمد التغريب البريختي يعني أعتقد أنه نحن استفدنا من تطور تجربة ونوس في فهم بريخت يعني وفهم دور المسرح التنويري والتحريضي بشكل أفضل، وهذا كان يعني مثل إذا بدنا نقول وفر علينا تجارب بجوز نحن كنا نخوضها بأنفسنا. أيضا تأثير ونوس ككاتب مسرحي دفعنا التفكير بعناصر تقنية محددة، السرد، الحكاية واللغة. السرد مثلا طرحنا الأسئلة عن دور الراوي الذي كان حاضرا بتنويعات مختلفة في مسرحي. دور السرد، العلاقة بين السرديات الكبرى والصغرى أي بين كتابة التاريخ والتأمل في وقائع عامة من خلال كتابة حكاية أفراد محددين وقصصهم. يشمل هذا أيضا الحكاية، فتجارب ونوس كما ذكرت قبل قليل وبحثه المستمر في الشكل جعلنا نتأمل في الفرق بين الحكاية والأمثولة وفي صعوبة التحرر الأولى من الثانية أحيانا، وهذا الفخ أعتقد وقع في ونوس في تجارب مبكرة. اللغة أيضا، وهون أشار الأستاذ إلياس بمداخلته طبعا، كان مسرح ونوس محفزا لجيلي للتفكير وطرح الأسئلة. شخصيا يعني أعتقد أن نصوص ونوس كانت من بين أسباب مباشرة دفعتني للابتعاد عن الكتابة بالفصحى. حدث هذا لزملاء آخرين لي دون أن تكون قطيعة نهائية مع الفصحى، لكن ونوس بالذات دفعني على الدوام للتأمل في حيوية اللغة في الكتابة المسرحية، وكيف أن جماليات اللغة الفصحى نفسها قد تصبح عائقا أمام درامية هذه اللغة حين تنطق بها شخصيات مختلفة تنتمي إلى طبقات اجتماعية مختلفة، أو حين تعبر عن مواقف يومية متنوعة. ونوس وهو المثقف الكبير طبعا رغبة لم يخفيها في تحميل الحوار المسرحي محاججات عميقة ومع ميل إلى التبشير والوعظ في بعض الأحيان. أعتقد أن جيلي وبدرجات متفاوتة لم يكن راغبا في حمل هذا العبء. أنا بس بدي أقول شغلة الحقيقة، مثلا في نص الاغتصاب في تمرين نحن عملناه مفيد بالمعهد لما نحط النص سعد الله ونوس مع النص الإسباني كان أسهل بالنسبة لنا نعمل تمارين على التمثيل والأداء اعتمادا على النص الإسباني وليس على النص ونوس. هون عم نحكي بس على درامية الكلام وليس على درامية الكلام وليس على أهمية النص وإحالاته بالمناسبة. أعتقد هناك مشاكل في يعني شخصيا هلا أتحمل مسؤولية كلامي في درامية الكلام عند ونوس في مسرح ونوس. الحق أن القدوة الكبيرة التي مثلها ونوس أيضا ظلال قد تبدو ثقيلة علينا يعني في المعهد أي مشروع لأن تكون كاتب مسرحي كان يصطدم بمقارنات تنتهي عند ونوس. يعني في مرة أستاذي أنا بحبها كتير هي كانت معيدة عند سعد الله من يعني فمرة هيك بهدلتنا اثنين خلص عنا هالكاتب مسرحي حاجة تجربوا يعني ما عنا غيره فما تتعبوا حالكم. كان هذا محبط في حينه. بدا لنا نقد ونوس ممتنعا في أحيان كثيرة داخل المعهد أو خارجه. فونوس مثقف مكرس جدا في العالم العربي أنا فيني أقول له سطوة حتى يعني قبل أن يكون كاتب مسرحي كبير. لكني أعتقد أنه لو كان بيننا الآن لكان أكثر الناس تقبلا لنقد قد يوجهه له أبناء جيلي أو برغبة في الاستفادة مما نراه ضعفا في أسلوبه المسرحي للانطلاق نحو أساليب جديدة أو على الأقل محاولة تلمس أساليب جديدة. هذا كان دأبه على الدوام. القسم الثاني قراءة أعمال ونوس الأخيرة في ضوء الثورة في سوريا. حدا مل؟ برافو عليكم. طيب. تفجرت الثورة في سوريا في لحظة بدأ امتناعها مستحيلا بعد أن شاهد السوريين أشقاء لهم في تونس ومصر وليبيا واليمن والبحرين وإن شاء الله أماكن ثانية ينتفضون ويحتلون الشوارع والساحات العامة ويرفعون أصواتهم للخلاص من أنظمة قمعية حكمتهم لعقود. الثورة في سوريا لم تكن نتيجة حراك سياسي منظم وبالطبع وبالتأكيد لم تطلقها نخب ثقافية. كانت الثورة انفجارا عفويا انطلق في جنوب البلاد قبل أن ينتشر في أرجائها في رد فعل على قمع النظام المتصاعد. إلا أنه شخصيا لطالما راودني السؤال التالي: ماذا لو قيل لبعض المثقفين السوريين ممن غيبهم الموت قبل اندلاع الثورة أولئك الذين لم يساومون قط على قضايا العدالة والحرية أن يكونوا بيننا اليوم؟ أنطوان مقدسي، عمر أمير الله مثالا، وأكيد سعد الله ونوس. بالطبع يعني يبدو السؤال افتراضيا ربما هي الحسرة بأن هؤلاء بالذات لم يكونوا معنا ليشهدوا لحظة تصدع زمن الاستبداد وبداية نهاية مريرة وطويلة لحقبة الدول القمعية. بكل الأحوال يبقى العزاء بأن إرث هؤلاء معنا، لا بل أن بعضه يعيننا على فهم جزء من أحوالنا المعقدة والصعبة في مخاضنا الحالية. في أعمال سعد الله ونوس التي تنتمي للمرحلة الأخيرة من سيرته المسرحية التي تمتد بين العام 94 والعام 97 وفيها كما تعرفون قاوم ونوس المرض بشجاعة عظيمة فكان غزير الإنتاج في الكتابة وخط ما يعتبره كثيرون أفضل أعماله وأكثره نضجا. في هذه الأعمال كما أعتقد إرهاصات عظيمة لفهم جديد وعميق لموقع ودور المثقف الكاتب المسرحي في التعامل مع سؤال التغيير وضرورته في بلادنا. أخص هنا بالذكر منامات تاريخية وطقوس الإشارات والتحولات والأيام المخمورة، ما يدفعنا لإعادة التأمل بأسئلتها على ضوء التفكير بأحوالنا اليوم. هي أن بعض الأسئلة التي وردت في نصوص ونوس يبدو راهنا كما لم يكن من قبل. فإن كان ونوس في طقوس الإشارات والتحولات ومنامات تاريخية والأيام المخمورة قد عاد إلى التاريخ القريب أو البعيد لينسج حكاية مسرحياته ويحملها أسئلة مؤرقة لحقبة منتصف تسعينات القرن الماضي، وهي حقبة الحقيقة كانت ترزح يعني وصلت فيها الأنظمة القمعية إلى ذروة قوتها باعتقادي يعني. لأن هذه الأسئلة نفسها التي طرحت في منتصف التسعينات حملت بعدا مدهشا في استبصارها لمآلاتنا المحتملة في محاولتنا للخلاص من هذه الأنظمة، وهذا ما نفعله اليوم. إذا لا تمثل استعادة هذه النصوص اليوم محاولة للاستعانة بوثيقة أدبية لفهم جزء من حركة التاريخ. أعتقد أن الأهم برأيي بالنسبة لنا كتاب مسرحيين شباب هو استعادة هذه النصوص، لأنها توجت رحلة بحث طويلة عن دور المسرح بفهم العالم المحيطنا ومحاولة وكيف نؤثر به. ككتاب شباب اليوم وكمشتغلين بالفن والثقافة عموما تواجهنا أسئلة صعبة اليوم فعلا حول التوفيق بين مواقف تجمع بين الانتصار لقيم الثورة والتحرر من أنظمة الاستبداد وبين التعبير عن هذه القيم بعيدا عن البروباغندا والوعظ وادعاء امتلاك الحقيقة أو حتى ادعاء أن نفهم ما يحدث حولنا تماما يعني. أعتقد أن في نصوص النصوص الأخيرة ما يقول أن الإعلاء من الحقيقة والحرية كقيمتين أساسيتين لا يتعارض مع الشك والتحريض على التفكير بالمسلمات، ولا يتعارض مع صورة الكاتب الذي لا يملك قدرة تغيير العالم بالمسرح، إنما يملك محاولة فهمه خلال المسرح. في هذه النصوص التي ذكرتها يسجل ونوس انتقالا واضحا إلى بناء حكاية تقوم على سرديات متوازية وليس صوت واحد، يعني تتعدد فيها الأصوات، إذن حكاية تضم شخصيات لها عمق نفسي وليست فقط أصوات تعبر عن أفكار مجردة. هذا الانتقال الذي جاء بعد صمت طال ل10 سنوات تقريبا تأمل فيها ونوس بشجاعة أعتقد مكامن الفشل في تجربة مسرح التأسيس، والذي أراد فيه المسرح منبرا للتعليم والتبشير، أو حسب تعبيره هو مكان لتغيير وتطوير عقلية الإنسان العربي وتعميق وعيه الجماعي. إذن هذا اليقين الذي حضر في مرحلة التأسيس عند ونوس أعتقد أنه حرم ونوس من طرح أسئلة كبرى في نصوصه، عاد وطرحها في أعماله الأخيرة. نرى في نصه الأخير آخر نص كتبه الأيام المخمورة أن الحكاية كلها تبنى على محاولة معرفة الحقيقة وليس تسليم الحقيقة. الحفيد يفتتح الحكاية قائلا: أيقنت أن في العائلة دملا يتستر عليه الجميع، وأدركت على نحو غامض أني لن أستقر في اسمي ولا هويتي إلا إذا كشفت الدمل وفقعته. قم الحكاية لنسمع فصولها بوجهات نظر مختلفة وليس وجهة نظر واحدة، دون أن نتنقل تماما كقراء كمتلقين. ما هي الحقيقة؟ سوى أن الأراغوز وهو شخصية في المسرح يقول: الحقيقة إبرة ضاعت في كومة قش. أصبح سؤال الحقيقة إذن عند ونوس سؤال باعث على القلق في هذه المرحلة الأخيرة، ونصه المسرحي مشغولا بالبحث عن الحقيقة لا تسليمها مطلقة إلى المتلقي. كتاب شباب اليوم تواجهنا أسئلة مؤرقة فعلا، ليس أصعبها أن نسأل عن أي حقيقة نتحدث في بلادنا اليوم، أو كيف ستخرج هذه البلاد من مخاضها. هناك أيضا أسئلة معقدة تتعلق بأدواتنا ككتاب، يعني بدور النص المسرحي اليوم. لماذا نكتب اليوم؟ لمن نكتب؟ هل من قيمة للنص كوثيقة؟ طيب إذا كان في قيمة للنص كوثيقة، ما معنى هذه الوثيقة إذن هي أسئلة لجيل باعث على القلق. أعتقد أنه قلق نلتقي به مع قلق ونوس الذي حمله لنصوصه الأخيرة، حيث لا يغيب اليقين فحسب، وإنما تواجه كل الشخصيات في نصوص ونوس الأخيرة، كل الشخصيات التي تسعى لتغيير جذري تواجه نهايات تراجيدية. سعاد وشرف الدين ينتظران موتا حتميا بعد سقوط دمشق وقلعتها بيد تيمورلانج في مناورات تاريخية، وكذلك شخصية الشرائجي الذي اتهم بالهرطقة، الماسة في طقوس الإشارات والتحولات، وحتى شخصيات مثل العفصة والمفتي في نفس النص، سناء في الأيام المخمورة. كل هؤلاء بطرق مختلفة حصدوا الموت أو الكمد، يعني نتيجة سعيهم إلى الحرية والانعتاق من قيود اجتماعية أو سياسية صارمة في أزمنة تحولات عنيفة. طيب ألا يحدث هذا اليوم في سوريا؟ أعتقد أننا جميعا نعرف أفرادا شجعانا خرجوا ليحرروا أصواتهم وإرادتهم السليبة، انتهى فيه الأمر إلى نهايات مأساوية. إذن يتبدل لنا كل يوم كم هي وعرة ومضنية هذه الطريق نحو الحرية. طيب في شيء آخر في نصوص ونوس الأخيرة أيضا بالمقارنات. ماذا عن الأماكن والشخصيات في هذه النصوص الأخيرة؟ دمشق بشكل خاص. يخص ونوس دمشق بغضب لا يخفى على أي قارئ، يعني في المنامنات على الأخص، وكذلك إلى حد ما في طقوس الإشارات والتحولات. ربما يذهب ونوس في القسوة على دمشق شوطا يراه البعض قاسيا بالتحامل عليها، لكن اليوم ألا ينظر كثيرون إلى دمشق بهذه الطريقة؟ أبناء مناطق تعرضت لقصف همجي لأنهم نهضوا بوجه نظام قمعهم لعقود خسروا كل شيء، وشعروا أن العاصمة لا تنضم إليهم أبدا، يعني خذلتهم مراراً وتكرارا. ألا يرون فيها اليوم مدينة طالما برعت في مهادنة الطغاة والتوافق معها؟ ألا يرون في نخبها التجارية والاقتصادية وفي مشايخها صورا مشابهة شخصيات دلامة وابن مفلح وابن العز وابن النابلسي في منامنات ونوس، أو حتى بهجة التاجر الدمشقي شقيق سناء في الأيام المخمورة؟ ألا تدور النقاشات المتوترة اليوم بين السوريين عن علاقة الريف الذي تحمل التكلفة الأكبر في المأساة السورية بالمدن الكبرى التي ترددت نخبها في الانخراط في الثورة واتخذت موقفا أقرب إلى النظام؟ أتحدث هنا عن دمشق وحلب بشكل خاص. ألا يشتد هذا النقاش في كل مرة مثلا تتعرض فيها دمشق لقذائف الهاون من الغوطة المحاصرة والمستباحة بشتى أنواع القصف الوحشي من النظام؟ في المنامنات مثلا عودة إلى نص ونوس، يحمل التاجر الحلبي النازح من مدينته المدمرة تحذيرا لأهل دمشق وتجارها بأن الخراب مصيرهم لا محالة إن لم يتحصنوا أو يتجهزوا، لكنه أي التاجر الحلبي لا يبقى أذانا صاغية، بل أن محنته تقابل بقسوة شديدة من قبل الدمشقيين، فلا لا يقع عونا ولا سندا، وهو يكاد يموت جوعا. بل وصل الأمر إلى أن يستغل تاجر دمشقي هذه المحنة وليقايضه على ابنته الصغيرة فيتخذ منها خليلة لمعاشرتها. شخصيا أنا بالمثل دمشقي أعتقد أن ونوس كان قاسيا جدا على دمشق هنا، فرغم أنها مدينة تجارة يعني تدار بأخلاق التجار البراغماتية، إلا أنه لم يعرف عن دمشق للأمانة أنها، وهي مدينة صعبة وعصية على الفهم، أنها نبذت اللاجئين إليها بهذه الطريقة يعني. لكن أعتقد أن ونوس هنا يعني كان نقده أيضا صعب في تلك المرحلة يعني. مرة أخرى كأنه كان شخصية اعتبارية يعني. والحق يقال يعني أن ونوس أيضا أعتقد أنه يحمل مرارة القادم من ريف همش طويلا إلى مدينة قضى فيها عمرا مديدا، متفاعلا حالما بالتغيير، عاملا بدأب في سبيله دون أن يرى فيها حاضرا حقيقيا لهذا التغيير. فدمشق ورغم أنها تفتح بعض أبوابها للوافدين، لكنها تبقي أخرى مغلقة بإحكام، لا تسلم مفاتيحها إلا لعائلات تدير بخبرة علاقة السلطة برأس المال. أعتقد أن ونوس حمل غضبه هذا لدمشق عبر استحضار واقعة تاريخية أراد منها أن يحذر الدمشقيين من مصير قاسي ستجنيه المدينة ونخبها إن بقيت تلعب دوما على فكرة مهادنة السلطات ومجاراتها. تحذير نجد أنه يقول أشياء كثيرة عن أحوالنا وأحوال دمشق اليوم، لا بل أنه يتبدى أحيانا على شكل نبوءة في المنمنمات بين مصير حلب التي تعرضت اليوم فعلا لدمار هائل خلال الثورة، ودمشق التي يبدو أنها تنتظر قلقة مصيرا قد يبدو مشابها. وإن كان موقع التتار اليوم مختلفا، فهم وإن كانوا الغزاة في نصف ونوس فإنهم يحكمون المدينة اليوم، لكن لا شيء يمنعهم من تهديمها إن فقدوا سيطرتهم عليها. حنث تيمورلانج بوعده لوجهاء دمشق ومشايخها ممن وقعوا معه الهدنة. أعتقد أن هذا ممكن اليوم في حالة النظام السوري. استحضار النصوص الأخيرة اليوم أيضا استحضار سؤال آخر مهم هو حول دور المثقف ودور النخب عموما. ففي حين يموت الأمل بالحداثة وزمن التنوير عبر نخب فسدت وأفسدت في الأيام المخمورة نصه الأخير، فإن أيضا شخصيات رجال الدين تنال نقدا شديدا من ونوس على دورها في هزيمة مشاريع التغيير وسعيها دائم لتوطيد علاقات متينة مع السلطات الحاكمة. نتذكر مشايخ دمشق أيضا في مناسبات تاريخية أو شخصية المفتي في طقوس الإشارة والتحولات. مجددا تبدو رؤية ونوس لهؤلاء ماثلة اليوم أمامنا خلال الثورة، هذه الثورة الكاشفة فعلا التي كشفت فيما كشفت عن الوجه العميق للمؤسسات الدينية الرسمية في سوريا وعلاقتها مع السلطة عبر نصف القرن المنقضي، حيث يقوم رجالات هذه المؤسسة اليوم في الدفاع عن السلطة بما هو ارتهان لهذه السلطة ودفاع عن مكتسبات تجمعها بهم. لكن نقد النخب المرتبطة بالسلطة أو المشغولة عن التغيير بمصالحها أعتقد يجسد بأفضل صوره في عند ونوس في الاستحضار الإشكالي لشخصية ابن خلدون في المنمنمات. فشخصية ابن خلدون كما تعرفون عند ونوس هي صورة لمثقف في زمن الانحطاط، تتراوح هذه الصورة بين فكرة المثقف المرتزق أو المثقف وليس والمثقف التقني، أي الذي يجعل من العلم والمعرفة حقلا مغلقا بلا روابط بالمجتمع والقيم. وهي أوصاف أقتبسها من ونوس حرفيا في نقاش له حول الموضوع مع الدكتور ماهر الشريف. مرة أخرى إذا تتلاقى أسئلة ونوس مع أسئلتنا الملحة جدا اليوم، ونحن نرى نفورا كبيرا لدى مثقفين سوريين وعرب مكرسين، نفورا من الانخراط الفعلي في عملية التغيير التي أطلقتها الثورات في العالم العربي، بل نرى أيضا مواقف متخاذلة وأحيانا أقرب إلى هذه الأنظمة، وهي مواقف في عمومها مواقف مثقفين حاليا تصدر عن ثلاثة أنماط سأختصرها بسرعة. يعني النمط الأول هم مثقفون عاشوا لسنوات خلت كمعارضين لهذه الأنظمة، لكن عقودا من التعايش معها على ما يبدو جعلت منهم بعيدين فعلا عن فهم الآليات التي انفجرت فيها الحراك الشعبي في الدول العربية، وجعلتهم يأخذون هون مواقف سلبية، إما لأنهم لم يكونوا مشرفين على هالحراك زعلوا يعني لأنه هم ما كانوا القادة، أو لأنه لا يسير وفق توقعاتهم وتعريفاتهم المسبقة يعني مع الكتالوج ما مشي حاله. كل هذه يعني وهذا الحقيقة أنا باعتقادي فضح تراكم انعزالهم عن الناس عبر السنوات الثلاث. وفضح أيضا أن منابرهم التي اعتقدوا أنها كانت يعني حلقات تنويرية كانت بطبيعة الحال يعني صوامع هيك مغلقة ومعزولة. وهناك نمط ثاني من المثقفين وهو في الصلب النمط الأول بخاصة لناحية التكوين اليساري أو القومي. هؤلاء ارتدوا إلى عباءة الحكم الاستبدادي باللبوس الوطني بين قوسين بحجة أن البديل الحتمي سيكون أنظمة إسلامية جديدة، فلا الأفضل نوقف مع الأنظمة الدكتاتورية العسكرية على أساس نرى نماذج كثيرة لهؤلاء المثقفين في مصر، في كتيبة كاملة منهم بمصر. ما في داعي يناصرون ثورة مضادة يقودها العسكر. النمط الثالث والأخير هو مثقفون صنيعة السلطة وأربابها. هو الحق أن في مواقف هؤلاء انسجام مع تكوينهم، وعجز طبيعي عن فك الارتهاب بما رعاهم ودفع بهم المواجهة. يعني هدول أصلا صينية الأنظمة وطبيعي يوقفوا معهم. طيب. ربما لا ينطبق أي من هذه الأنماط تماما على صورة المثقف التي استحضرها ونوس عبر شخصية ابن خلدون في المنونات، لكن إشكالية العلاقة بين نتاج المثقف بمعزل على مواقفه الأخلاقية والعملية من قضايا إنسانية كبرى هو السؤال الملح علينا اليوم. يقول ونوس مثلا: هل يمكن أن أعيد هذا الاقتباس له؟ هل يمكن أن أعيد قراءة أفول القمر لجون شتاينبيك، يمكن تعرفوه، دون أن أشعر بأن سلاسة القراءة تتعثر بموقف شتاينبيك المؤيد للعدوان الأمريكي على فيتنام؟ كم شتاينبيك عندنا اليوم بالعالم العربي؟ هذه مشكلة كبيرة، من أدونيس ليوسف القعيد يا أبو عفش يعني والسلسلة الطويلة. هل يمكن بالفعل يعني فصل النتاج الأدبي عن مواقف المثقفين أو الكتاب من قضايا التغيير اليوم في المنطقة؟ أخيرا، في ظهوره الأخير مع ميرالاي في الفيلم المعروف، بدا لي ونوس رغم شجاعته العظيمة في مقارعة المرض العضال مغرقا في التشاؤم. مظبوط ديما؟ انتابني هذا الانطباع في مشاهدتي الأولى للفيلم قبل سنوات قبل اندلاع الثورة في سوريا. رغم أنه وضع هذا التشاؤم في سياق منطقي وهو يسلسل أحداث مفصلية في حروبنا الخاسرة مع إسرائيل وفي هزائمنا المتكررة كشعوب أمام سلطات شمولية قمعية، إلا أنني شعرت أني لا أريد أن أقبل هذا التشاؤم المغلق من ونوس بالذات. أحالتني هذه السوداوية الحقيقة إلى صورة المثقف اليائس من الناس. مع هذه الصورة استعدت في حينها عندما شاهدت الفيلم نصوص ونوس الأخيرة لأرى أن الأمل يغيب في خواتيمها جميعا، وحتى حينما يحضر هذا الأمل عرضا فإنه يحضر في صورة نهر بردة تتدفق مياهه بعد طول شفاف، لكن الأمل لا يحضر عبر بشر أو شخصيات أو أفعال. أعرف أننا نعيش اليوم أوضاعا عصيبة وبأن حاضرنا لا يحمل أملا بانفراج قريب، لكننا حقا أحدثنا شرخا في جدار الأبد المصمت هذا. يكفيني هذا للتشبث بالتفاؤل وبأن أقول أن ما يحدث اليوم فعلا ليس نهاية التاريخ. ليتك معنا يا سعد الله. شكرا.
Thank you very much. What we're going to do, as I said, is Rula Balbeki will give a very brief capsule here for those of you who could not follow the Arabic, and then we'll proceed afterwards with Ted Zitter's talk. Okay?
No. Okay. Okay. For those of you who know both Arabic and English, I'm sure you're going to be very disappointed because I'm not going to mention any of the very nice details that Al-Attar, mentioned. I'm just going to go over the very, very, very briefest main points of the talk. So Muhammad Al-Attar wrote that the paper is divided into two parts. Part one contains a synopsis on the impact of Wannous on his generation of playwrights and theater makers in Syria. Wannous's heritage is visibly present in the method with which my generation acquired their theater experience, first as readers, then as budding playwrights. He was one of the founders of the Higher Academy of Dramatic Arts in Damascus, which produced several theater makers and discussion groups with or around Wannous. Besides reading his plays, characterized our work with him. His works formed a large part of life at that academy. Wannous always emerges as a symbol of an intellectual example to follow. He has been able to prove that writing for the theater is still possible during times bereft of cultural and intellectual impetus. Following this role model as an intellectual presence helped us keep up the hope for the efficacy of the theater and writing for it. My generation was better able to understand world theater through the knowledgeable experiences of Wannous, who understood world theater and expressed it using a register closer to our idiom. His concern over human rights issues gave my generation a chance to appreciate how political awareness and the maturity with which we grasp content would affect the method of playwriting and other issues of form and content. The theoretical writings which accompanied his texts in his politicized theater contributed to our ability to decipher the fraudulent appearances in promotional/political theater and constructing deeper visions for the efficacy of the political and social theater in societies under totalitarian regimes. Wannous also influenced our generation in considering the constituents of a play, such as narrating, storytelling, language use, language parts, and therefore prioritizing and interrelating them in our work. Whereas criticism of Wannous was seemingly not permitted back then, I do believe that he would be open to the criticism that my generation might have for his work now. And then Muhammad moves to part 2, which is reading Wannous in light of the Syrian uprising. The revolution or uprising was a natural and spontaneous explosion which was affected by what was taking place in other Arab countries. And then he writes about Wannous again. When we reread Wannous's texts today, we can trace a prediction of the status quo. Rereading the texts allows young playwrights to understand the relationship between the theater, plays, and the world around us, and our attempts to influence it. In Wannous's texts, giving a higher value to truth and freedom does not conflict with doubt and questioning postulates. It does not conflict with the playwright who may not be able to change the world through the theater, but who can attempt to understand the world better through the theater.
Thank you. Thank you, Thank you, Mohammed Al-Attar, and thank you, Rula Balbeki. And our next speaker, as I said, is Edward Zitter from NYU. His paper is entitled Wannous and the Call of History.
Thank you. So first I just wanted to say how pleased I am to be part of this symposium. And very pleased to see so many students. And I look forward to hearing your guys' opinions and impressions afterwards.
I believe it's a class leaving. It's not,
I'm just
worked in the theater many years. When I see people leaving a theater, I get nervous. So I don't want you to. It's not,
Just kind of give them a minute. All right. So as nostalgia for and invocations of a noble past resonate across the Arab mediascape, it is important to re-examine Saud Wannous's career-long interrogation of the use and abuses of Arab history. In a host of plays that range from the expressionistic to the realistic, Wannous examined how individuals and institutions invoke the past to inspire resistance, justify violence, and distract and placate populations. Wannous not only examined the use of history, but modeled an alternate historiography, one with the expansiveness of poetry. Such a historiography is neither positivist nor materialist, but seeks to redeem the seemingly lost potential of the past in present action. Wannous's theater acted as a counterpoint to a Ba'athist refrain depicting a timeless and unchanging resistance to invaders, beginning with Saladin and culminating in the struggle to liberate Palestine. I wish to present Wannous's dramaturgy as a philosophy of historical imagining, one that the playwright developed in response to Ba'athist ideology. Like all totalitarian ideologies, Ba'athist historiography is not an attempt to understand the present as the product of historical processes, but rather an opportunity to further demonstrate the consistency of the movement. In this case, Ba'athism is the beating heart of Arabism. Hannah Arendt has explained that in the totalitarian worldview, quote, "The movement does not spring from experience but is self-generated. It transforms the one and only point that is taken and accepted from experienced reality into an axiomatic premise." Quote, "Invaders invariably approach the timeless borders of the Arab nation. True Arabs invariably rise in defense of the homeland. Every event in the past and present is an opportunity to demonstrate this unchanging principle. In such a formulation, there is no room to ask what constitutes Arab, homeland, or invader. The goal is not to question, but to further provide proof for what is already known." Wannous does not so much refute this ideology as co-opt some of its central images and tropes. He then repurposes this material so as to imagine alternate historiographies, quote, "shot through with the chips of messianic time," to adopt Benjamin's evocative phrase. Rather than treating the past as evidence of a predetermined trajectory forward, Wannous steals that past from official culture so as to present an image of world-altering possibility. In Wannous's dramaturgy, the past is replete with moments in which society suddenly veered towards radical change, only to see control reasserted by elites at the 11th hour. Now, as the totalitarian imagination spreads like wildfire through our shared mediascape, our need for Wannous's radical dramaturgy is greater than ever. The very moment that Arab dictators appeared consigned to the ash bin of history, new forms of totalitarian thinking reared. Daesh combines nostalgia for the worst of medieval barbarism with 21st century technology and propaganda machinery. As such, Daesh repeats the strategies of European fascism, which combine the cult of tradition with the worship of technology. Whether masquerading as a rebuttal of the capitalist way of life or Western decadence, fascism is invariably a rejection of modern skepticism and analysis. Like European fascism before, Daesh is not so much at war with the spirit of, is as much at war with the spirit of questioning that drove the Enlightenment and the Nahda as they are at war with a specific political order. I want to think about Wannous's theater as an inoculation to the faulty historiography that undergirds totalitarian ideologies. His plays function like a vaccine, introducing a specimen of totalitarian certainty and groupthink, so as to cultivate a bodily defense to indoctrination. Like an inoculation, the goal of his theater is no less to transform the patient, imbuing in her the ability to fight off invasive ideology while sparing the developing self. The spectator moves towards true citizenship through a growing capacity for complexity, contradiction, and analysis. Elsewhere, I have argued that taken as a whole, Wannous's body of work represents history and heritage as mutually constructed ideas. Helping an audience recognize this dialectic is, first and foremost, a strategy of enabling that audience to see beyond the state's construction of the past. It is not that Wannous provides a true past, rather, Wannous intervenes in the construction of the past to open up opportunities for transgressive self-imagining. Today, I want to think about this project specifically as a response to Ba'ath historiography. I do so not simply because I wish to contest party depictions of Syrian history, but because in my mind, the use and abuse of Arab history figures into the violence that racks the region today. In this paper, I will discuss Wannous's highly controversial play, Historical Miniatures, which I present as a meditation on the writing of history. In the process of undermining the idea of a stable, retrievable past, this play similarly undermines the boundaries that define the body of believers, the nation, and the homeland. Finally, if that was not enough, the play provides an unexpected, if not scandalous, perspective on Ibn Khaldun and the Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 1982. I wish to examine how Historical Miniatures upsets ideas of history disseminated by the Ba'ath Party, I'm not offering a detailed reading of historical miniatures, which I've done elsewhere, but will instead summarize its historiographic strategy and explore its relation to Ba'ath ideology. In this interplay, I will identify strategies of creative resistance that may serve us well in this age of totalitarian violence. Historical Miniatures was a controversial play on its publication, and the objections circled around issues of historical representation. It depicts Tamerlane's siege of Damascus in 1399 and uses the presence in the city of Ibn Khaldun, one of the greatest scholars of the Muslim world, as occasion to reflect on ideas of historiography and sociology. Many condemn the play for its depiction of Ibn Khaldun, who makes himself a tool of the invaders. But even more striking is the fact that the play likens the failure of Arab leaders to defend Damascus against the Mongols to the failure of modern Arab leaders to defend Beirut against Israeli bombing campaign in 1982. The play presents three modes of historical consciousness, all of which are highly problematic. The first is the chronicle, a flattened historical perspective in which an array of facts are presented without apparent hierarchy or order. This mode is present in the figure of the ancient historian or chronicler, which would be a better, though less literal translation. The second mode is Ibn Khaldun's precursor to modern historiography, in which a guiding principle, in this case asabiya or social solidarity, is understood as the engine of historical change. Finally, there is Wannous' own strategy of historical rupture and poetic affinity. While the chronicle is radically different from the kind of historiography Ibn Khaldun championed, the play similarly levels critiques against two modes of historical writing. Neither presents the morality or objectives of the historian as a necessary object of historical analysis. Chronicle is ignorant of its own selection criteria, and so the flood of a river is given equal weight as the siege of a city. Ibn Khaldun's science of history presumably rectifies this problem. In the play, Ibn Khaldun explains that his science of social organization allows the historian to examine events purely in essence or effect as manifestations of social power. Such a historiography frees the historian, in the words of Ibn Khaldun, from whims and biases. However, the play demonstrates that by assuming himself to lie outside systems of power, the historian makes himself a tool of power to disastrous effect. While the ancient chronicler might be powerless in the face of oppression, Ibn Khaldun actually aids such oppression. The title of the play, Historical Miniatures, or Manamnamat Tahrikiya, asks us to read commonalities between Ibn Khaldun and the chronicler. Manamnamat were a genre of miniature painting lacking perspective and crowding a plethora of locations and objects into a single frame. The fact that the play takes its title from a genre of representation that is diametrically opposed to Ibn Khaldun's scientific historian speaks of the impossibility of ever fully extracting oneself from the flow of events within which one writes. If the play is itself a series of manamnamat, then Ibn Khaldun is in fact mired in the flat, crowded space of the miniature, despite his assertions to the contrary. Neither the chronicler nor Ibn Khaldun's scientific historian present a historical consciousness capable of resisting power. In response, Wannous fashions an alternate historical consciousness, one that facilitates political action. He dispenses with the myth of objectivity and he adheres to Nietzsche's dictum, "Who can only explain the past by what is most powerful in the present." Wannous reveals that his epic history resides within a contemporary moment of crisis. He accomplishes this feat by structuring a series of temporal ruptures in the play that build in emotional intensity. These ruptures thicken the time of the now, demonstrating how the entirety of the past lives within the present. This in turn frees the audience of historical determinism. but also strips the audience of reassuring myths like progress. The barbarity of the past is with us as a boundless potential lodged in the DNA of every moment. The first rupture comes when Ibn Khaldun acknowledges that he is a character in a play, remarking that he will be remembered for the sciences he has founded and not for his own inaction when confronted by the potential destruction of Damascus. When criticized for his indifference to suffering, Ibn Khaldun responds that these disputes over morality will only be remembered by the, quote, deluded, like the author of this play, end quote. Of course, Wannous did not remember these disputes, but invented them. However, with his ruse, he dispenses with temporal homogeneity. The temporal homogeneity of historicism. Past moments of crisis and revolutionary potential are always in our now, and through them we commune with what has been and what will be. In the second rupture, the actor playing the chronicler steps out of character to confess to the audience that he cannot entirely conjure up the seemingly indifferent tone of the character he plays. In part, the performer confesses the challenge of all acting, connecting the given circumstances of the play to the inner life of the character. The dilemma the play suggests is that the historian feigns disconnection to the emotional life of the past, quarantining the present from its effects in a way that is antithetical to art making. Art has the power to undermine the divide that isolates the present from the past, allowing its audience to experience a state of emergency that is, in our modern age, the rule rather than the exception. This series of deepening ruptures culminate when a character defending Damascus against Mongol invasion relates a dream that very clearly depicts Israel's 1982 invasion of Lebanon. In damning language, she describes the nations of the Arab world watching impassively as Israeli aircrafts bomb Beirut. I don't need to tell the people in this room of the devastation wrought by Israel's 11-hour saturation bombing campaign that took place after the PLO had agreed to leave the country. That campaign killed between 17 and 19,000 Lebanese and Palestinians and left another 30 to 40,000 wounded. Despite announcements on state radio that Syria would, quote, fight Zionism and imperialist enemies to the death, end quote, the Syrian Air Force remained grounded in the initial days of the invasion, and Syrian troops in Lebanon were ordered not to engage the Israelis. Mubarak accused Assad of a secret deal with the Israelis to divide Lebanon. Gaddafi criticized Assad for his acceptance of a ceasefire, and King Hussein condemned Assad for, quote, liquidating the Palestinian cause. While Ba'ath historiography frequently looks to the past, for evidence of a spirit of Arab unity that drives Arab aspirations into the future, Wannous depicts the atrocities of the past as already imbued. Wannous depicts the atrocities of the present as already imbued with past crises. I'm just going to reread that. Yeah. While Ba'ath historiography frequently looks to the past for evidence of a spirit of Arab unity that drives Arab aspirations into the future, Wannous depicts the atrocities of the present as already imbued with past crises. It is not that the past is prologue, a trajectory carrying us forward, which is the project of the Ba'ath ideology. Rather, the past is present in every instance that we fail to resist barbarism. And I put this particular cover up because I think it really captures the essence of that play, which is to say that this is a play about the present moment. It is not a play about the past that makes reference to the present. It is a play about the present as culminating a long history of barbarism that we have never been able to resist. Despite Syria's relative inaction during the 1982 war, within a few years, Syrian historiography had already recast it as an example of Syria's stalwart defense of Arab lands. This is the power, by the way, of Ba'ath ideology. It is able to level the events on the ground in its complete disregard for reality and stay on script. So 82 becomes yet another instance of Syrians defending the Arab homeland. I will return to Arab depictions of 1982 later in the paper, but first I want to reflect on the understanding of history that allows such a sleight of hand. First, it is important to note that for Baathism, there is an unambiguously defined Arab nation that has served as the engine of Arab aspirations throughout history. To this day, so whereas, there's this whole question of whether Arabism is the product of Islam. To the contrary, for the Ba'ath, it's very clear. Arabism is eternal. It has always existed. Its boundaries have always been permanent. And Islam is a manifestation of this eternal spirit, as is everything else that we do as we move forward through history. To this day, Syrian school children start their day chanting, "One Arab nation with an eternal mission." In that beginning, they never get around to stating what that mission is, the Risala Khalid. It's just this statement that everybody knows. And it's Michel Aflaq's coinage, and it's echoed throughout the Ba'ath Party Constitution of 1947. I just cite one example here, which defines a, quote, trans-historical Arab mission appearing in renewed and complete form in different stages of history, ever struggling to express its being for the betterment of all nations of the world. In this formulation, history is imagined as the site of repeating manifestations of Arabism rather than Arab identity or aspirations as the product of historical conditions. Colonialism is simply that which constrains the genius of the Arabs. Just as the Arab is unchanging across centuries, so are the challenges Arab face. Speaking on the occasion of the 800th anniversary of Hattin, then Minister of Culture and subsequent Vice President Naja al-Attar stated, quote, "The soil which has borne Saladin is the soil that has produced Jamal Abdel Nasser and Hafiz al-Assad, who came to complete the mission of Abdel Nasser by liberating, unifying, and awakening the Arabs to prepare them for battle. The mission and the battle are eternal, whether we find ourselves in the 21st century, the 19th century, or the 12th century." While the quote from Naja al-Attar might strike us as comic, it enacts a central objective of Ba'athi historiography as defined in the party's 1947 constitution, and that's the second bullet point. The educational policy of the party aims at the creation of a new Arab generation which believes in the unity of the nation and in the eternity of its mission. In my remaining time, I wish to explore this Ba'athist historiography as an ideology against which Wannous developed his own highly idiosyncratic sense of history. Given my limited time, I will look at one site, which I will relate back to Wannous. While one example can hardly be said to capture the complexity of an ideology, I justify my method by noting that the site I've selected is highly overdetermined. Completed in 1994, the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier sits on Mount Kesun. The monument is composed of a huge arch, 120 feet high, that extends over an elevated dome, which is 66 feet high and 130 feet in diameter. With its surrounding gardens, the monument covers over 1,360,000 square feet. However, the real ideological work is done in the halls beneath the structure, which contain 5 large paintings depicting Arab armies in battles within Greater Syria from the golden age of Islam to the modern era. Only 2 of the images depict unequivocal victories. The Battle of Yarmouk of 636 and the Battle of Hattin of 1187. 3 images of modern warfare It got cut off, but it's the Battle of Mount Hermon in 1973 and the Battle of Sultan Yaqub in 1982. And these are defeats or questionable victories at most. However, taken together, these images tell a story of persistent Syrian sacrifice against foreign forces. As a whole, the tomb is a masterpiece of unintended irony. The hall's visual history of Syrian warfare begins with the arrival of Islam. The Battle of Yarmouk, I actually don't have an image of the Battle of Yarmouk. The Battle of Yarmouk was a seminal event in the Muslim conquest of Greater Syria against the Byzantine Empire. The irony of a Bath monument beginning a history of national struggle with Yarmouk is striking. I'm going to ask someone to find the light switch. Party founder and theorist Michel Aflaq asserted that Islam was a specific manifestation of an eternal Arab mission, rather than the region's Arabism being the result of Islamic conquest. However, this contradiction was a hallmark of a government that, post-Hama, continued to imprison members of the Muslim Brotherhood at the same time that it promoted a Salafi cultural project. This is the regime that in 1976 prohibited a production of Mamdouh Adwan's Night of the Slaves, supposedly because of its depiction of the companions of the Prophet, rather than remarking on its implication that the regime was morally and ethically bankrupt. In this context, it is noteworthy that most objections to historical miniatures were focused on its depiction of Muslims rather than its condemnation of government inaction in 1982. These kinds of misdirect serve a regime that denied the existence of dissent at the same time that they persecuted it. In fact, historical miniatures does attack religious fundamentalism, but not by attacking Ibn Khaldun. Rather, the play focuses on the beliefs and actions of the Islamic judge and historical figure Sheikh Burhan al-Din al-Tadhali. In the play, al-Tadhali condemns a man for heresy by asserting that men exercise free will. Al-Tadhali's insistence on a divinely ordered universe that extends to human actions and knowledge is the counterpoint of a political ideology that sees an eternal mission driving all human events. It is not surprising, then, that Wannous similarly critiques Ibn Khaldun's concept of asabiya for making radical change impossible. The next painting in the hall further underscores the Muslim identity of Syria and its ruling regime. Saladin's victory at the Battle of Hattin led to the Muslim reconquest of Jerusalem. At the center of the image, Saladin rides a rearing horse as crusaders in the foreground bow before their conqueror. The dome of the rock is prominent in the background and visible over Saladin's right shoulder. The last detail is a geographic impossibility, though it is entirely consistent with the hall's imaginative geography. Hattin opens for the Arab army the gates of Jerusalem. During Hafiz al-Assad's presidency, state propaganda regularly connected the president with the medieval Saladin. As Lisa Wadeen notes, captions to newspaper photographs often cited him as, quote, the gallant knight, a reference to Saladin. The implicit idea that Assad is Syria's hope for the reconquest of Jerusalem was made explicit in a poster distributed widely during the 1991 presidential referendum. That image superimposed Assad's face over a depiction of the Battle of Hattin with the caption, "From Hattin to Tishreen." I myself, I know, it's comic. I myself remember the large mural that hung in 1994 at the entrance of the Souk al-Hamadiyya depicting Hafiz al-Assad and Saladin. Whereas the Assad regime proclaimed a line of continuity uniting past and future victories, Wannous reveals within the Arab now a dense past of betrayal and hypocrisy. I will skim over the next two images only to note that the Battle of Maysalun in July of 1920 and the Battle of Mount Hermon of 1973 have been enshrined in Syrian historiography. At Maysalun Pass, a small force of poorly armed irregulars led by Yusuf al-Ezmeh, Syria's 36-year-old defense minister, sought to defend the newly proclaimed Kingdom of Greater Syria against 10 French brigades supported by tanks and aircrafts. The image at the tomb takes part in a hagiography in which Esme has been, quote, immortalized by Syrians as the supreme national martyr, in the words of one historian. The fourth painting depicts the Battle of Mount Hermon in 1973 October War. In that battle, Syria took temporary control of an Israeli Defense Force outpost in the Golan. If Syrian historiography has made Esma a principal emblem of the anti-French struggle, that historiography has made Hafez al-Assad the emblem of 1973. Of course, this history conveniently displaces 1967 from view, a humiliation that is the subject of Wannous' play, Evening Party for the 5th of June. The final and fifth painting in the Hall of Tomb of the Unknown Soldier depicts the Battle of Sultan Yaqub of 1982, in which an Israeli battalion advanced into Lebanon through Syrian defenses only to be cut off and surrounded by Syrian forces. The Israeli battalion eventually escaped, but left behind 8 disabled tanks, one of which is displayed outside the Tishreen war panorama with other recovered Israeli military hardware. From the vantage of 1994, when the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier was completed, it was possible to cite the performance of Syria's troops as a great victory, their victory in 1982. By that time, it was clear that Israel had failed to install a pro-Israeli government. Lebanon was once again firmly in control of Syria. The regular loss of Israeli soldiers inside the security zone in southern Lebanon weighed heavily on the Israeli public. And while the Israelis did succeed in driving the PLO from South Lebanon, the invasion spurred the development of Hezbollah as a potent military and political force. Historical miniatures written in 1993 serves as a corrective to an enforced historical forgetting that would be memorialized in the 1994 tomb. Just as that monument asks visitors to forget 1967, the monument also asks them to forget Syria's muted response in 1982. The Ba'ath Party's historiographic machinery has never let the facts get in the way of a good story. And so it is left to poets and playwrights to structure new, more truthful ways of remembering. I took my title for this paper, A Call of History, from Wannous' 1963 play, Cleansing the Blood, Fasad al-Dam. Quote, "Do you hear that overpowering call from afar, from the core of our noble past?" A character asks, in a scene that culminates in the symbolic slaughtering of half of his own consciousness. That scene, like so many in Wannous' body of work, would seem to warn against the internecine violence that follows when we obey the call of history, without first asking, who has shaped its voice? Oh, yeah.
All right, thank you so much. That was wonderful. So as we change gadgets here, let me introduce our final speaker, and then we'll have time, as we did this morning, for questions. The final talk today will be by Sahar Asaf, and it's entitled Speaking the Unspeakable on Directing Wannous.
Thank you, Robert. I think actually the accurate title for my presentation today would be Experiencing the Unthinkable, but we'll see. Okay. So I will explain a few aspects of Saadallah Wannous' plays from a direct practical work. I directed the world premiere of the English language versions of Wannous' Rituals of Signs and Transformations in 2013 and The Rape in 2015, both translated into English by Robert Myers and Nada Saab. Although Wannous is established as one of the most acclaimed playwrights in the Arab world, his works haven't been considerably produced as one would think, and are just beginning to reach the stages of countries in Europe and the United States. The most notable Arabic productions of Rituals and The Rape were the ones by Nidal al-Ash'ar in 1994 and Jawad al-Asadi in 1992 respectively. Both were staged in Lebanon and over 20 years ago. In 2013, the Comédie Française produced Rituals under the direction of the Kuwaiti Suleiman al-Bassam, and in 2014, Robert Myers organized staged readings of Rituals at the Martin Segal Theatre Center in New York and Silk Road Rising in Chicago, the latter under my direction. And just today we learned that The Rape was actually produced in Germany in 3 different theaters, but that was also over 20 years ago, right? My introduction to the work of Wannous came in 2003. I was looking for a play to direct for the drama club here at AUB, and I read Drunken Days. I remember thinking then that I need another 10 years before I dare approach this play. I am grateful now that I succumbed to my fear of directing Wannous then and chose The Fate of a Cockroach by Tawfiq al-Hakim for the drama club production. Exactly 10 years after my first encounter with Wannous, I received an email from Robert Myers inviting me to collaborate with him on producing and staging Rituals of Signs and Transformations in English. Excuse me. I went and read Rituals again. After a 3-hour comeback to the text, I thought to myself, maybe in another 10 years. I went to Robert with the excuse that we cannot do this play with 20-year-old students because one needs a lifetime of intense experiences to understand the complexity of Wannous' characters. Robert maintained his enthusiasm for the play and suggested that we work on securing funding so we can bring on board experienced actors and designers. Obviously, my hesitation had a little to do with whether students would be able to play the subtleties of Wannous' characters and themes, and a lot to do with my own fear of transforming the play into the stage. Yet no one in his or her right mind would say no to Robert's suggestion. Remembering what Jonathan Miller said about directing Shakespeare encouraged me. In his talk with Helen Critchinoy, Miller said, and I quote, "There's no mystery about it. You can do it or you can't do it. It's like bike riding. You learn directing by directing. You learn each time you do a play. You can learn what you need on the job. The mystery is in the head." In our second meeting, Robert and I agreed on doing the play and set a tentative action plan. Needless to say, we had to deal with a number of difficulties before starting the process. For example, lack of a theater infrastructure at AUB and lack of a drama production office. Our break came when people like our chairpersons, our dean and provost expressed interest in funding the play. As soon as Robert secured a starting fund, I casted actors and hired designers. The first 3 weeks of rehearsals were table readings and improvisations. I took almost a month working with actors before I casted them in particular roles. We rehearsed daily for 2 months, 3 to 4 hours a day, late in the evenings in classrooms and sometimes in my windowless office. Rituals opened on December 3, 2013 and played 4 nights to full houses at Babel Theatre, which has a capacity of around 300 seats. Audience members sat at Babel Theatre for 2 hours and 20 minutes without an intermission. The production proved to be a theatre sensation and spurred us to greater efforts. Our next Wannous production was even more charged, The Rape. We applied the same model, that of students working side by side with professionals. This time we took the project one step further and initiated collaboration with LEU that offered the Irwin Theatre for the production. The Rape opened on March 20, 2015 and played 9 nights. It received several good reviews from audiences and critics. I haven't seen the previous productions of the plays, namely that of Nidal al-Ash'ar and that of Jawad al-Asadi, but from my experience working on both plays and despite the success of Robert and my productions at the audience and critics level, the best directorial method to be used in mounting Wannous plays is yet to be found. My goal as a director is to capture the spirit of the play, which required that I depart from Wannous specifications for Rituals as well as for The Rape. As a director, my starting point is always personal and differs with every production. I believe, like many have said before, directing is like storytelling. While the playwright told his story on paper, I'm telling it on the stage. I quote Miller again, who said, quote, You're telling the story of the play in a different tone of voice, and you're hoping in doing so that the actors will do as children do, that is, start to ask questions. What's next? And oh, I know what's next, and they start to contribute, end quote. So I start by asking myself the question of where is my story in this play? For Rituals, my starting point was a nebulous conception of what the characters must be like that later developed into a particular social and philosophical notion that I got from the text. Rituals is set in 19th century Damascus. It's marked by mystical mood dominance. Mood arousal happens through word choice, theatricality, and through clashes in the dramatic action. Notice, for instance, the stage directions for the peak scene of Naqib al-Ashraf transformation into a Sufi dervish. In the home of Abdullah, a Sufi circle of devotees who are invoking God is at the peak of its intensity. Abdullah is in the middle of the circle, turning, swaying, repeating, Allah, Allah. Or notice Almasa's words, worth quoting at length, trying to explain to the Mufti what she's looking for after her transformation into a prostitute. This will sound vague. It's difficult to explain. As I sway on the edge and the abyss calls me, I imagine that at the moment I fall, colored feathers will grow out of my pores. Feathers will sprout from the roots of my soul, blossoming into perfection. I'll fly like birds fly, like the breeze and the rays of the sun. I want to cut these harsh ropes, digging into my flesh and suppressing my body. Ropes woven out of horror, modesty, and chastity, feelings of being sullied and filthy, out of evocations of the Almighty. Slab upon slab under which the body withers and fades away. I want to liberate my body, Sheikh Qasim, to untie these ropes that suck the life out of it. I dream of reaching my inner self and becoming as clear as glass, having the eye see my inner being. All the translations I used in the presentation are those of Robert and Nada, obviously. During the first week of rehearsals, the idea of the dual worlds that the characters inhabit became very clear to me. All the characters, except for Simsim and Warda, the prostitutes, the two characters who own their bodies, all the other characters are living in dual biospheres. There is an inside, the private, and there is the outside, the public. The public and private schism is not only represented in the dramatic and verbal action, but also in the locations of the scenes. The play opens with a conflict happening because Naqib al-Ashraf decided to exhibit a private identity in a public space, which is an orchard. It became apparent that it's actually the conflict between the public and the private of those characters is what's leading for their transformations. Transformation in the play is not essentially changing into something else, better or worse. It's more linked with a death, a physical death or a social death connected to the character's decision in turning their back at their public self. When Naqib al-Ashraf was caught fornicating with a prostitute in an orchard, he broke. His transformation started not because of the act itself, but because other people could see him do it. He started on a journey of self-discovery. Similarly, when Mu'mina decides to throw herself over the cliff by becoming a prostitute, she was actually throwing herself into her inside. The abyss is her internal world. Notice what she says after her first encounter with the Mufti. Now, Mu'mina, shall we answer the call of the abyss? Shall we change everything? I have a cold chill running up my spine. Shall I sit in front of the mirror and make myself up? Shall I throw out my name and break the strongest shackle that has bound me since birth? Later in the play, when the Mufti and Hafsa were driven to get in touch with their internal selves, they were devastated. It's as if these characters were living outside the wall of their internal selves, and the moment they started dismantling this wall, they lost the ability of their senses. They lost control, they died. Dismantling the walls that separate them from other aspects of their humanity led to their physical and or social demise. I write down in my directorial journal, change is scary. We conceal the aspects of our personality that the society rejects. This game of concealing parts of us happens over a process. We keep hiding things as we grow. Days come when we will need to grow walls to be able to hide everything we can't show. We live before the walls. We think we forgot about what we hid behind. We think the facade is us. We become accustomed to it. Change becomes impossible. Change becomes death. Then in a moment we are reminded of what is behind the wall. We want it, we bring in the hammer, and we start dismantling. The noise of this deconstructing deafens us. We can't hear the world roaring behind us. We bring the wall down. We look at us, at the many of us. We smile, we turn back to show the world what we got, but the world is standing there in silence. We are dead. This understanding of the play made it clear to me why the protagonist of Rituals must be Mu'mina al-Masam. I found the spine of the play. When Mu'mina decides to claim her agency as a human being, as an entity on her own, when she decides to let go, although she's not sure what will happen to her, she flew over the cliff. As soon as she does, the whole world around her erupts into turmoil. The abyss is her internal world. She flies above herself and above her desires. Now she understands that all the other characters in her world are stuck before their walls. She can see both sides of the wall. They can't. She can see that they too are victims and that their animosities towards one another are only based on fear of what's behind their own walls. She understands, she loves, she's tolerant, she's a goddess. Just because Wannous plays are text-based plays, it doesn't mean that they have a definitive meaning embedded in the text. In fact, exactly because much of what happens on stage is conveyed through verbal interaction between psychologically complex characters, the play becomes very equivocal and its realization on stage becomes a task of making highly complicated decisions from line to line. Deciding that Al-Masa is the protagonist of the play is only a version of the story one hopes would be a convincing one. This decision of whose play it is came very early in the process of directing Rituals. While in The Rape, I only realized that I chose Mother Sarah to be the protagonist, from which the conflict of the play stems on the 6th performance of the play in front of an audience. In the last image of the play, I decided against Wannous' resolution that the mother should express something after the murder of her son on the hands of her platonic lover. Wannous said via Dr. Minahin, the funeral was modest, the mother showed no emotion, she shed no tears. What inspired this decision is a moment in rehearsals when I asked the actress playing mother to push a table into the acting area as if it's the carriage of the baby the character is taking care of. The image brought to mind Mother Courage. The similarity between the character of Mother Courage and that of Mother Sarah suddenly surfaced in my imagination. And I thought if Mother Courage exerted a silent scream for losing her third child to the war, Mother Sarah cannot but express something. I found the ending of the play. Mother Sarah will come on stage after his hack is killed to pull his dead body away, just like an animal would bury its dead or cover it with foliage. She will express a basic animalistic instinct. That's fair to me and to Wannous. Wannous warns in his introduction, and I quote, against presenting Israeli characters in a comic, coarse, or exaggerated manner, end quote. I thought that having the mother express no emotions after the death of her child is quite an exaggeration. Yet putting words into her mouth would be untrue to Wannous, but having her body express something that Wannous did not write would be fair. This bodily gesture that I made the actress playing the mother do actually takes Wannous' warning one step further by polishing even one of the most orthodox characters in the play. Only in the 6th performance that I understood the image I composed early on in the rehearsals. I realized that what Mother Sarah is doing by kneeling to pull the body of her dead child is actually bending to and accepting the tragedy that her teachings and beliefs caused. She transformed at the last moment, and lights go down in the image of her transformation. The word hope that Wannous closes the play with becomes the hope of the transformation of Mother Sarah. The blackout that separates that image from the closing scene where Dr. Menahem summons Wannous on stage becomes a moment for the audience to detach from their emotional engagement with the play and hopefully make that discovery. Eventually, this change in the finale ended up serving Wannous' warning in his introduction and supporting his statement in the closing scene. For instance, when Dr. Menahem asks him about the implications of the statement in the play, "It's either them or us," he said, "We can't go out of this trap as long as beliefs like Meir and Gideon's are the principal ones on the other side." I thought if Mother Sarah can realize the fatal tragedy that her beliefs caused, there will be hope. In Rituals, the case was different. Although I decided who my protagonist was early on, I still could not decide on the ending of the play. Wannous killed Almasa on the hands of her brother who was seeking his manhood. The resolution comes with Al-Mufti mourning her by starving himself to death and the whole city going into disarray. Hamid, one of the city's notables, comes on stage after Safwan kills Almasa and says, "When the news spread, the city was enraged. People became despondent. They worried that bad things would befall them. The Mufti, who was relieved himself of his post, tore his garments and shrieked with grief. He remained in his house and swore not to eat or drink until God took him away. Peace has evaporated. We live now in disarray, and no one knows what the future will bring." For me, this cannot be the end. The Mufti, by starving himself to death, was slowly annihilating the greatest symbol of patriarchy, which was what Almasa was fighting against throughout her transformational journey. Peace cannot evaporate from the world of the play after the death of the patriarch, at least for me. The future must be brighter, I thought. So I decided to cut the last scene that gives out Wannous' resolution and to choose instead that the play close on the climax, the dead body of Almasa. But just before lights fade to black, have a subtle yet obviously optimistic change appear to the audience. Easy said than done, obviously. I still could not find this slight change. I went back to the basic aspect that defines my job as a director, that of storytelling, and asked myself, if not the resolution of Wannous, and if the play climax at the death of Almasa, what happens next? From this improvisation with the self came my instinctive answer: a new day starts, and before I could continue, it hit me. A new day starts with the adhan, the call for prayer. It's only 2 days before the opening of the play that I discovered that the next convincing action in my version of the story is to hear the sound of the morning prayer, which we heard before in the play, only this time it will be called by a woman. I ran to my sound designer then, Rafif Ghali, and asked him to make this possible, and he did. I want to... Okay. We can listen to it later. So, the voice of the woman after Almasa's death cannot remain a awra. While for Rituals, my starting point was a philosophical concept that rotates around the protagonist's journey in the play. For the rape, my point of departure was the devastating images of the separation barrier, or Jidar al-Fasl, built by Israel to imprison and isolate the occupied Palestinian territories. These images of the wall, coupled with my emotional reaction to them, were the lens that I used to define the spine of the play, its themes, point of views, and implications. As the case is in Rituals, the rape is people with psychologically complex characters that are mainly portrayed via verbose dialogue, which demanded special attention to analyzing and understanding the individual functions of the characters. I used this stage as a space to detach and scrutinize the human relationships in the play rather than to illustrate the locales indicated by Wannous. That's why the elements of design were not determined in advance, rather they were generated throughout the rehearsal process. I started by giving my set designer, Ghida Hashishu, images of the separator wall, coupled with music pieces that reflect the feel and mood I was imagining, namely a futuristic piece. I wanted an abstracted image of a prison to be the set where the play takes place. The idea stemmed from an obvious observation. the wall built by Israel to isolate the Palestinians did actually imprison the Israelis as well. Despite huge differences, the prison exists on both sides. The next set of images I shared with Rida were images of places taken from the text itself, like Al-Fari'a prison, for instance, and from other parts of the world. The set design transformed over the course of 1 month from this to this to this, one more, and that was the sketch before final. In the end, the scenography complemented with the lights gave a feel of a prison. Arwa Itani from As-Safir wrote, "Everything is cold and dark on stage. The scenography reminds one of the prisons and the blue torture rooms with the heavy fluorescent lights." This is how it looked like. Using prison as a metaphor to construct the set consequently affected how I think and use my other tools as a director. With my costume designer Bashar Asaf, for instance, we chose to dress both groups in what can resemble prison outfit. Categorizations in colors and fabrics were used to distinguish between characters who transform and those who don't, rather than between Palestinians and Israelis. The prison metaphor also determined the acting method I had to employ as I worked with my actors. To explain this, I have to go back to the beginning of the process. I start with table work. We read and reread the play. Sometimes I ask actors to read various roles, not only those they are casted to play. We agree on the facts, the non-negotiable aspects about the text. For instance, the rape is set in 1989. It takes place in the West Bank 2 years after the break of the First Intifada, etc. Every actor then has to research facts about their own character's history and the starting point, the forward and backward analysis of the text, but they are encouraged to look outside. For the rape, it was mandatory to create a clear separate world between the Israeli characters and the Palestinian characters, especially that in the scenography I was going in the direction of creating one world. This required that during some rehearsals I separate the actors playing Palestinian characters from those playing Israeli characters. One effective exercise we did was a debate on whose cause is just. I asked the actors to answer the question of whose cause is just from their character's perspective. What was great about this exercise was that the actors, especially those playing the Israeli characters, had to put their personal politics and judgments behind and research the cause from the perspective of a Jewish and/or Zionist individual living in the West Bank in 1989. An exercise we logically never do in this country. The day we played the debate, we started with raising the flag and standing for the national anthem of each group. For obvious reasons, actors asked that we delete their pictures with the Israeli flag, so I don't have any here, and we did. Actors playing the Palestinian characters expressed after the game their frustration and anger. They felt oppressed. The politics of the body are of great significance in Wannous plays, especially in the rape. It's a bodily experience that paved the way for Ishaq's transformation into a compassionate human being and Dalal's transformation into a resistance fighter. After her rape in the torture room of the Shimbet and in front of her husband Ismail, Dalal says in her dialogue with Al-Fari'a, "It's a land in which we don't even own our bodies." Working with the metaphor of a prison and the oppressed and violated bodies of the characters, it became a major necessity to guide actors to know their own bodies and understand the emotions of their characters through it. For this purpose, Augusto Boal's techniques of theater of the oppressed were very useful. The skipper and the soldiers exercise, for instance, was very effective to help actors playing Palestinian characters understand the effect of oppression on one's body and physical expression. The objective of the exercise is simple. A skipper wants to pass from one side of the room to another, while a group of soldiers blocking her way. It was very interesting to see that most actors would begin first by physically fighting their way through the wall of soldiers, although I never mentioned how they were supposed to achieve their objective. After the improvisation, I would ask the actors to notice the effects of the experience on them, not only psychologically but also physically. How were they breathing? Was their stomach muscles tensed? What about their hands and legs? Boal's image theater was another effective method I asked actors to improvise the emotional spine of a particular scene into a still image. Then I asked them to observe their physicality in the image. What muscles were tensed? Where were their eyes focused? And so on. Then we took this image and used it to find the beats and intentions of the scene. When we worked on the scenes, actors would replicate the physical gesture they found through the improvisation to incur an emotion. When this method did not work, I used psychological gestures. We agree on a subtext and then play it with a physical gesture. Once we find a convincing tonality, I ask the actors to remove the physical gesture and play it only in their imagination while saying the line. These methods helped me bring the actors closer to understanding and playing the three-dimensional structure of the character rather than one aspect of it. Other straightforward methods came to help. For instance, I had actors playing Israeli characters to wear the kippah during rehearsals. Although I didn't use it as a costume props for the performance. It would have been very dangerous for actors to play the side of the character they are drawn to and ignore its other dimensions. However, in my work, telling actors where to stand and how to move on stage comes very late in the process, and most of the time it comes organically by asking actors questions that will aid them to act logically in the given circumstances of the play. I focus my attention on helping actors create a world. As for how the world will be used is kept for later in the process. In Wannous theater, the world of the play best surfaces when we say the text or the visible while playing the subtext or the invisible. This calls for a double reading of the text and the subtext. Each interpretation is a build-up of a certain viewpoint, which in turn make meaning more of a liminal state between rehearsals and performances. In each rehearsal, while we try to reach to the viewpoint or points of the playwright, the semantic context and the rehearsal text are left open-ended. Cutting the text of both rituals and the rape has been a detrimental and organizing viewpoint in building our interpretations of the stories. Rituals was 45 minutes shorter than the original duration of the play, and the rape was about 30 minutes less. As director Katie Mitchell accurately put, and I quote, "Cutting a text can be a perilous business. By mistake, you can cut through major arteries. Scissors are very dangerous," end quote. I have to give credit here to Robert, who worked with me not only as the co-translator and producer of the plays, but also as a dramaturg who knows how to work with the scissor. Wannous is very accurate about human behavior. He dissembles and dissects his characters, which makes it quite a journey for us to define their internal structure. Yet sometimes Wannous seems to slide in a very subtle way from writing dialogue to writing a narrative. Choosing what to keep and what to lose when adapting his plays to the stage becomes an extremely hard task. When characters seem to be saying things that they would only think or feel, Robert and I would agree directly on losing the line because we can play it in the subtext. But most of the time it took us hours of work and of analyzing the text forward and backward to decide on a small cut. It's a great risk in Wannous to lose an expositional material that relates to characters' intentions, as this will make it more challenging for us to get the deeper structure and the meanings in the play reach the audiences. As a director, I use the play to serve my purpose with genuine faithfulness to the playwright's intention. That's what makes, in my opinion, my reconstruction of Wannous plays, as well as other directors, only alternative versions of the original text. Losing part of the text was as much of a decision as adding nuances and actions that Wannous never wrote. For instance, losing the last 1-minute scene in which Wannous provides his resolution for rituals and adding instead a long walk for Almasa to her last scene, where she will be murdered, came to support the role of the goddess I gave to Almasa. She knew that it's the end, and she walks on stage carrying a bed sheet as if it were her kafan, the shroud, and in the background an abstracted Sufi music that gives the scene a feel of a funeral procession. She placed the cover on her bed and sits to read for the last time the 1001 Nights, the book that changed her life. A perfect example of how the rehearsal text depends highly on other performance vocabularies such as props, light, and sound to produce meaning. Jonathan Miller believed that, and I quote, "the function of art is in fact to produce complex experiences in the mind. I hope, therefore, that the audience will bring their full imaginative apparatus to bear on what they're hearing and seeing. If they don't, they will see only one colored light. I hope they see the whole spectrum," end quote. Thus, the meaning that ensues from each performance is dependent on the communion with the audiences and is in turn a rehearsal for the next night. My main challenge as a director is to immerse the audiences in the world of the play and to make them lose their sense of direction. To be able to do that, I first have to lose my sense of direction. Directing Wannous for me has been an astonishing excursion into the depth of the complex psychology of characters that embody individuals I denounce in my everyday life, to be specific, patriarchs and Zionists. Despite being highly poetical, Wannous' observations have surpassed those of theoretician and political analyst. For me, the importance of Wannous theater lies in challenging the most basic moral beliefs of both theater makers and viewers. In 2013, Rituals for me was about Almasa's conscious journey to transformation. If I were to stage Rituals today, I would definitely reconstruct it in a way that would depict the Mufti as the protagonist. The play transformed me in ways that would not allow me to see otherwise now. In my initial readings of the play, I was glad I would have the chance to expose the malicious aspect of this religious figure. I thought it's my chance to take revenge against similar figures, religious sheikhs, for all the injustice they commit in the name of religion. Only later in the process that I realized how deeply in love I was with the Mufti. Only Wannous taught me to see how this symbol of patriarchy is the first victim of the patriarchal society he protects. At your age and you've never known love, asks him Almasa, to which he answers, I used to believe love was a corruption devised by the idle and impudent. Only Wannous allowed me to see beyond his facade and into the depth of his miserable and shattered humanity. It broke my heart and made me understood why Wannous' Mufti has no other way to go but death. I felt compassion towards him. It made me more tolerant. I'm ill, he said. I'm consumed by love and longing. My sanity and willpower have waned. All that remains is this love that burns in me and estranges me from myself. In some ways, Wannous plays are testing our entire social and moral systems. In his response to the rape production, writer Adham Dimashqi wrote for Skoon, a social and cultural online magazine, and I translate, Saudallah Wannous transformed me into an apostate according to the deep-rooted fundamentalist beliefs. Because from the moment I will demand two rights, the right of the Palestinian to his motherland and the right of the Jewish to search for his humanity and his future outside the myth and the bloody godly promise. This is how Saudallah Wannous allowed us to experience the unthinkable, and that's why I do theater. Thank you.
So thank you, Sahar, thank you, Mohammed, and thank you, Ted. We do have time for a couple of questions, so please, the floor is open. I know it's late in the day. Obviously, you know, those of us who participated in the production could, you know, I have questions after speaking, but, oh, good, we have a question here. Do we have a mic? Now, do we have, sorry.
How you criticized Wannous and then how you reinterpret Wannous after the Syrian revolution was very interesting. But Actually, I was expecting more revolt. Wannous was an institution, as you said, and you were studying in that institution. And I was expecting a more revolt against this institution. And to tell you the truth, I felt something very Damascus in your way of criticizing. For Ed, I think Munamnamat, which you analyzed in very, putting it in contrast with the Ba'ath ideology. First of all, Munamnamat must be put in the frame of a new wave in Arabic literature, which went beyond the dominant hypothesis of the Nahda. The Nahda never accepted to deal with the so-called inhitat. And the Nahda from Jerzy Zaidan on tried to show our history as one, it's not the Ba'ath ideology, it's the Nahda ideology, which actually kicked away all the atrocities of our history from our history books and from our consciousness of history. And what people like Jamal Ghitani, for example, in Zaini Barakat, he took us back to the Egypt of the Mamluks. That is to revise al-inhitat. And in this sense, Wannous's Munamnamat must be put in this frame in order to understand. The critique is much more profound than criticizing the Ba'ath. It's criticizing this mythical way of seeing history from the point of view of resurrection, which actually now, the name of the Ba'ath party is resurrection, but actually the real resurrection came now with Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. And if you want resurrection, this is the resurrection. So that is, if you want the past is not the imaginary past of the Nahda, the past is what we are witnessing now with, and so on and so forth. So I think this is a major point which must be put, and for Sahar, really I enjoyed very much your way of dealing with theater. I would like to be a student one day.
Okay. I'm a Damascene, this is maybe stronger than I can challenge. I think there's no room to go to explore more of how our generations, and I'm not sure I'm entitled to speak on behalf of my generation seriously, but at least on my behalf, maybe I just spoke briefly, but I mentioned that Wannous really, and I meant that literally. He was one of the reasons why I neglected writing in Fusha, for example, and I think I think there is, and just responding to a point that highlighted by Sahar, I think one of the reasons why Wannous is not really adapted a lot, there are many reasons, of course, is because really whenever you put the text on the stage, you will find genuine difficulties in transforming the language into dramatic language. And I think this is I don't know, I'm not saying this is a fault in the text, or not a weakness, but this is a way to criticize it and to say that, I don't know, I think myself, I get rid of this burden of imposing on my language in the play a lot of sophisticated, or a lot of, how to say, desire to have decent debates and some deep, sophisticated debates, So yeah, I might have explored this more. And I said at the end, I think that, and this is something I feel disappointed in personal level, like someone knows that I think he should be more, how to say, I think he was not a big believer really in the people to stand up, yeah. And I said this in the end of my note, yani. And that's why I think that I wish he was here with us, because I think as a Marxist, as you mentioned in your contribution earlier, and as somebody who spent his life really resisting and fighting, it's sometimes for me his position, يعني, at least from what because I didn't meet him personally, but and from his writings, conversations, or even the last movie of Amir Light, is a position which is يعني, more or less common between established intellectuals who really spend genuinely their lives يعني, fighting and resisting, but you feel that they don't يعني, somewhere in their hearts believe in people يعني, to the end. يعني. I don't know. We need maybe another take too, but yeah, I agree. But at the same time, and sorry for يعني, taking too much time listening, of course I also influenced by Wannous, and I respect him and I love him, and maybe part of my criticism is because of how much I don't know, affected by him sentimentally, not just professionally.
So, thank you. I agree with you entirely. When I say that totalitarian regimes are not so much interested in fighting against specific political orders as they are against fighting a battle against Enlightenment and Nahda philosophy, I don't mean to assert that in contradicting a totalitarian ideology, Wannous is then celebrating the spirit of the Nahda. To the contrary, it seems to me that he's looking for some kind of alternate historical imagination that takes us beyond the positivism of that period, or even the kind of Marxist dialectical approach that you see in his early work, in the later work. And in fact, I think that's actually what puts, in some ways, whether it's Mananamat or Ihtisab or Takus al-Isharat wa Tahawalat, the thing that is, that in my mind, brings those three plays together is this search for a divine violence. When we were thinking before about, when we were talking in the first session about the political program that Wannous seems to be implying, it strikes me that, in fact, that's where we go wrong when we're looking for a particular project that can be manifested in a series of actions. Because I find it useful to think of Benjamin's distinction between state creating violence, state preserving violence, and what he calls divine violence. That there are certain violences that bring states into power, and then states have to exercise that power. And so how do you get out of that cycle of state creating and state persevering violence? And Benjamin proposes that there might be something called divine violence, which he never defines, but which is that kind of violence that ruptures the homogeneity of time and allows us to see how we can, what elsewhere he calls the kind of messianic chips, the straight gate through which the Messiah may enter at any time. If we can imagine violence as a way of rupturing things and complete transformation, it seems to me that hope is what is implied in that extremely disturbing, admittedly disturbing passage about suicide, shahad, as this moment of joyful sexual self-fulfillment. And it seems to me that similarly, Takus is not a story of self-fulfillment and a mere rejection of patriarchy. It is a story of a kind of radical legibility in which the individual surface and interior becomes one, a kind of radical deconstructing of how we understand identity. And in some ways, it's the personal version of a political agenda that is equally indebted to mysticism, which is why I think that Massa and her husband go on similar trajectories, but both of them are mystical. It's not just coincidental that they're constantly going back between these Sufi scenes. It's because Sufism, and particularly this version of Sufism, which is without a guide, without a master, is in some ways the parallel for the journey that Massa takes. Yeah, I mean, exactly. I mean, in other words, that's a long way of saying exactly.
And Sahar, would you like to talk to Elias about being your student? No?
You know, hold him accountable on that. Can I remind?
Some more questions? Yes.
Thank you. I think these were really three very wonderful talks, and we'll probably all like to be your students. I would like to come back actually to the depiction of maybe the depiction of violence. No? Okay. The depiction of violence, and try to some of the talks here back to what Friederike said about violence. You mentioned, Ted, you talked about a more truthful way of remembering in art, and I wonder if we can count Wannous' depiction of violence in very direct ways as part of this truthful ways of remembering. And Muhammad, you also talked about, Ha'i'a and Hurriya as, two terms that kind of recur in his work. So my question is, do you think that this depiction of violence, how does it stand out, and how does it maybe help us, today, looking at Wannous today, to come to, if you want, terms with some of the very direct exposure to violence we experience, especially in the context of the Syrian revolution?
Do you want to go first?
No, you please.
That's a fascinating and challenging juxtaposition. Because on the one hand, I do think that Wannous is struggling in the later works with violence and reclaiming violence as a space of potentiality. And there's this kind of mystical component of that violence. There's these opportunities for kind of self-discovery and transformation in a violence that would be the end of violence. However, and you have the same encounter, when you read Benjamin, there's always this problem of, well, what constitutes divine violence? It's fascinating reading until you try to translate it into real world actions. And of course, every revolution imagines itself as divine. Every revolution does not imagine itself to be law-giving violence. They understand it to be divine violence. That's why they always set the calendar to 0, because the world has been recreated. So in some ways, that's the dilemma, is that in fact, there's a way of looking at everything that has unfolded as true to Wannous' vision of what a revolution can be. At the same time that I recoil from that idea and say, well, no, this is in fact precisely the kind of violence. I guess the thing is that the distinction I would make is that for Wannous, violence is connected to a profound uncertainty. That in seeing these moments of past violence erupting in the now, he is in fact suggesting that our historiographic method is faulty, that there's always multiple ways, or even like a play like Drunken Days, where it stages its own impossibility of creating this story, right? I'm only gathering elements of a story from someone else and never actually sure of what I'm depicting. And that uncertainty, I think, haunts a lot of the later plays. And to that extent, I think that's, where his historiographic project and the place of violence in his historiographic project differs from the kind of totalitarian violence that we see spreading across the region now. I feel like I haven't taken up the challenge of your question, but that's really the most I can do.
What was just briefly, Lana, just your precise question to me?
helps us also to see from a contemporary perspective, how we deal with the very violence we are exposed to on an everyday basis with what's happening now with the Syrian revolution.
I just can speak. I don't know. I mean, this is really, even personally, I don't have really maybe good answer because I'm personally still reluctant of how we reflect on what we see. And we had weeks ago or less, maybe we had this cinema festival here in Beirut where Syrian films were they were screened, and a few of them were really about documenting violence in Syria. And the debate was again very vivid here in Beirut. From one side, I think it's we cannot just turn our backs, and we need to sometimes to look and sometimes to reflect directly and sometimes even to document. But on the other side, how we expose this, it is a question really, a question of representation too, and a question of course, an ethical question of to what extent we are allowed really to deal with this. And I think, just resonating to what Edward mentions, but I think the uncertainty in itself, and that's what I briefly highlighted in his later text, and that's why I think these texts are for us today are very important to reread, is that there's no one answer to many questions, including these questions, and also that you need to allow for multiple narratives at the same time, not to pretend that you own the truth, or even to own a full understanding of the picture today.
Well, one thing that's worth considering is that, for example, Al-Ihtisab, you don't really see much. It's very Greek. It's like the messenger arriving in the Persians, the first extant play, tells you of the whole disaster. And it's true, it's enacted on stage, but it's a narration. And what we see is people unraveling as a result of violence. And it's very interesting with my students, for instance, who see a lot of graphic violence in their face, and they see it in the media, and they see it in films, that to be in the physical presence of the result of violence and trauma is itself a much more profound experience than showing close up, a rip, because, Buñuel and Dali have sort of taught us, 80 years ago, showing an eye being slashed or whatever has a moment of shock. But once you see it again, and you see it again, and you see it, it has no effect. However, words have the potential, and I do think this is the shift to some extent from Marx to Freud, which some people have criticized Wannous of, is that here, and this is a turning point, we actually see somebody try to find the language to express the unexpressible, that which cannot be said. And this is something we came up against with actors who were acting in their second or third language. I think in the New York Times today or yesterday, there was an article about what language in which to have therapy. And we talked about this in rehearsal, which is to say, if you are accessing extreme emotions, if you're extremely sick, it's in your native language. If you have any doubt what your native language is, get very sick, get very scared, and you'll find out. You'll find out real fast that you do have a native language, and that's it. And Wannous creates those situations, and this is one reason that people say, well, why can't it be in Arabic? is because they have experienced these sorts of extreme emotions. And they have a very good point. Not only is it a root language in which it alludes to all of these other feelings, it gives it a density it would otherwise not have. And so we, the translators, are in the position of saying, well, what do you gain? This is exactly what the Russian reader of Tolstoy says. If you read Dostoevsky in Russian, you can't imagine, what's lost when you read it in French. And something is lost, but something is also gained, too. And one thing that's gained in answer to Muhammad's comment is that you're forced to synthesize what would otherwise be prose speeches into direct dialogue. And you're also in a vernacular, to address Elias's comment. You have to translate into a vernacular. The diglossic dilemma of Arabic evaporates. Pick whichever vernacular you want. So violence as such, what's interesting about your question is how much of it is embedded in the words, in the language, and in the gestures and the semiotics. What we perceive as the direct representation of violence, we see very little of in Wannous. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to. I'm supposed to be the moderator here. I didn't mean to. My students are always accusing me of giving a harangue. I'm sorry. Yes, we have a question back here. We can try. Why don't we'll try the mic. We just don't want you to have a, splitting earache tonight from the feedback.
Okay. First of all, I want to thank this panel thank you for organizing this panel, which gives us an interesting insight to an apparently underrated playwright whose themes still have relevance today in light of everything that's happening. I will admit, though, I've only ever seen one of his plays, which was The Rape, which I saw last week. But that motivated me enough to attend this panel to understand more about him. The question I have is directed to the panel as a whole, with the director, writer, intellectuals, etc. Considering the ideas that Wannous had in his plays, as far as I can tell, do you think, in light of all that we're seeing right now in the Middle East, with the dilemma of Islamism versus dictatorships, with the far right-wing victory in Israel, etc., do you think that we have yet to see an upsurge in Wannous's works, or maybe even his themes that he was trying to work into his plays?
I hope yes, my answer to that. As a director, I still dream that I'm going to do one day Drunken Days, so I can promise you that, but I don't know when. I think Wannous, when the first time I read The Rape, when Robert suggested that we also direct stage display this year, the first thought that I had, this is written 89, it's definitely outdated in terms of the political message, so many things changed, to the political conflict between Palestine and Israel. There was no war, there was no Hamas, etc., etc. But it cannot be more timely, really. And you saw the play, the themes in the play, the characterization. Same thing in Ritual. For me, it was Rituals of Signs and Transformations. It's written, and there's a distance. Wannous distanced the play into the 19th century, Damascus, but I've never seen a work that speaks to our present more than Rituals of Signs and Transformation. You have to see the audiences sitting in the auditorium, for instance, during the homosexual scene, like two gay men expressing love to each other. It was overwhelming to see such a reaction, and this is a play also written like more than 20 years ago. So I guess yes, and I hope with now Wannous being also translated into English, it's going to open more eyes on him, and we're going to see more of his plays on international stages.
That's one reason I was able to figure out that the rape would be relevant is I'm an American, so it helped me out a lot.
I mean, I would also add, yes, I think that Wannous's work is especially relevant right now, and I don't think it's coincidental that there suddenly been all of this interest in translating his work. I think the rest of the world has finally arrived at a point where they are able to engage the complexity of this region and of this moment, and which is why I think other playwrights were being translated 10 years ago, even as Wannous was writing, and I think we're beginning to catch up with him. So I think we're going to see more and more of his productions throughout the world.
Footnote, Wannous in Arab world is not underrated at all, by the way. He's well-known, established, just to be precise. For me as a writer, I think it's provoking today, Wannous text is to read them again. It's really provoking towards the new debates and. But I think just also this is my impression, the interest in the region is driving people to translate also Wannous. So it's not also. So this is what happens usually whenever you have a crisis or in a region that the rest of the world out of sudden become interested in this region, and so of course and so people now are more open to translate and to discover literary talents, and of course Wannous is at the top of the list in Syria.
We have time for one more question. If not, if you wanted to say anything to it. Oh, we do. We have one more question, and then maybe Saud can wrap it up. And yes, the microphone here to Mona here. Thank you.
I will speak in Arabic, if you allow me, because I will feel more comfortable in it. سحر أنت قلت آخر المداخلة تبعيتك إنه شيء كتير خطير إنه الواحد يقصقص من الصعب للنص. بعد 8 عروض 9 actually وقطعوا والعرض كان 2 ساعات. بعدك بنفس الفكرة.
I likes your question. So her question whether I still think after the 8 performances of a 2-hour play, whether I still think that cutting Wannous text is a terrible, very hard business. Yes, I still think so. Actually, at some points, I felt during the scenes that maybe I can live without that line, but at other moments I felt maybe not. And again, this has always to do with the audiences. Every audience brings their dynamic into the theater, into the night. So every night is different. As I said, there are meanings that I figured out in the play watching it with the audiences. And this is a never-ending process. So if I'm to reflect now on the play, I'm probably going to find much, much more interesting meanings, I hope. So it is hard because at points you feel that Wannous writes the subtext outside, but it's not always the case. And it's the build-up, it's the life experience of those characters that get them to change and to transform. So if you cut that out, you're actually leaving, behind a very important aspect of their being, of their characterization. So it is hard, but I agree that staging them, as Muhammad is saying, is not an easy task because we're not, especially in Lebanon, we're not used to more than like 50-minute plays. And for us, we talked about this a lot, to have people sit in the auditorium for 2 hours, 20 minutes with rituals and 2 hours for the rape without an intermission was on its own a success and a first. So we can get the audiences used to that kind of theater, I hope.
All right. Well, thank you very much. I did want to remind you before, if Sahar has a final note she wants to say, I wanted to remind everybody that there is a screening today at 6 o'clock of Omar Amiraleh's There Are So Many Things to say, Still to Say, which, if I'm correct, it's in Arabic with French subtitles. Is that correct, Sonia? No, but yeah, and, it's a very, very vital piece of the puzzle. So you've seen it alluded to over the course of the day, and the reason why is there's so much very, very interesting information in the film. So it'll be over at Batish Auditorium in West Hall at 6 o'clock, so we hope you can join us. It's a 50-minute film, so it's not as long as the plays, but please try to join us for that. And now Sahar has a couple of thoughts as we close.
Yeah, actually, let me first, I wrote something here, so I'm just gonna, this was really a wonderful and enlightening conference, and I would like, on behalf of the organizing committee, Sonia Tassi and Robert Myers, and our assistant, graduate assistant, Razan Farhat, we want to thank all the speakers, Mohammed Lattar, Frederick Panwick, Elias Khouri, Dima Wannous, Nada Saab, and Edward Zitter for their devotion and dedication to Wannous and his theater. And of course, we want to thank all of you participants for your contribution, which made this a very interesting conference. Thanks to the Department of English, the Office of the Dean of Fine Arts, CAMES, and CASAR for their generous support, and Rula Baalbaki for helping with the translations of the talks by Wannous and Al-Attar. What better exchange than seeing speakers from the US, Germany, Syria, and Lebanon come together to reflect on the works of a playwright that has given so much to theater and to the world. I would just like to close with, actually, because some of you may not have been here in the morning, and we had a very interesting opening personal note by Dima Wannous. So I'm just gonna mention that, I guess, to save you time to take a break before the film. Dima shared with us in the morning under the title, Be What You Want to Be, and actually the lessons that one, just if I want to sum them in 2 words, the lessons that one can learn from Wannous' teachings to his own daughter are those of satisfaction and imagination. Dima shared with us how her father forced her to start reading at age 10, but never forced her to read his own plays. Only after he died that she started reading his work. He used to rewrite the history and geography lessons for her to better understand them. He taught her how to question all the lessons she is taught at school and how to use sarcasm to lighten the heavy load of rigorous school system. And I'm mentioning this note because we have so many students in the audience, and I think you will enjoy that. The one topic he never tolerated discussing with Dima was God. He kept repeating, God does not exist. Dima said that for the last 4 years with her father, she was living every day as a procrastinated funeral. Wannous was an extremely melancholic person, she said, but the disease changed him. In his last years, he wrote some of his most important work. He talked to her about his hatred for his father and love for his mother, and it's the first time I get to understand that dynamic of relationship some of the characters in Rituals has with their father, and same thing with in Al-Ightisab, the rape. Muhammad has such a weird relationship with the father. Now I get to understand that. She was the only girl at her prestigious school who did not own a car. She thought that not owning a car was the normal thing and the opposite, the abnormal. She asks, how was he able to teach me satisfaction without pointing it? He was actually teaching her freedom, and I loved that. As they would pass next to houses in the taxi to Tartus to meet his friends, they used to imagine the life stories behind the windows and the walls of people's houses. We played games with these lives and ran wild with our imagination, she said. They would laugh with those leading happy lives and felt compassionate towards those miserable beings that they don't know. Through teaching satisfaction and enhancing her imagination, he was teaching her an invaluable lesson in freedom, and I hope we can take that with us today. I'm going to keep my other comments to hopefully there will be a publication coming out of this conference to be edited by Sonia and Robert. But let me just close by saying or borrowing from Wannous, we are condemned to hope that this conference will become the precedent to similar conferences on other Arab playwrights and theater makers from this region. We do need that. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming today. We really appreciate it. Hope to see you at the film, and I want to thank my collaborator Nada Saab over here, without whom there would have been no text or presentation. Thank you.